On a freezing morning in Victorian Bath, a forgotten daughter opens the servants' door and finds a pale widower with a burning child in his arms. Her mother orders the door closed. Society demands she look away. But Arabella Kent, the invisible sister, chooses compassion over reputation, and that single act of mercy tangles her fate with a man hiding a dangerous past and a forbidden title. What secret is he running from, and what price will she pay for saving him? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and confess, what do you love most about historical romances? Bath, England, winter of 1871. The city was cloaked in a quiet, breathless chill. Beneath its grand facades and classical columns, the air carried the scent of coal smoke and damp stone as the first frost of February clung stubbornly to window panes and cobblestones. The Kent residence, nestled on one of the narrower terraces above Queen Square, stood still in the blue-grey light of morning, its windows shuttered against the cold and its hearths yet unlit. Arabella Kent rose before the rest of the household. She always did. In the stillness before Beatrice's sharp voice filled the drawing room or Louisa's perfume soured the breakfast air, Arabella found solace in the hush of duty. With her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and her gloves already thin at the fingertips, she descended the back stairs with the grace of someone long accustomed to being unnoticed. She did not expect the knock. It came not at the front door, never there, but at the narrow side entrance where coal was delivered, and Mrs. Holloway sometimes left parcels of root vegetables. 3 gentle raps, followed by silence. Not urgent, not begging, simply there. Arabella hesitated only a breath before unlatching the door. The cold swept in first, biting her cheeks and lifting the hem of her faded wool skirt. And then, him. He stood tall, despite the way exhaustion pulled at his shoulders, his breath forming pale clouds before a face too pale for a man accustomed to labor. His coat was heavy and worn, with buttons mismatched and threadbare cuffs, and in his arms lay a child bundled in wool, cheeks flushed with fever. "I beg your pardon," the man said, voice gravelly and low. "I've no one left to turn to. My son, he's burning with fever. Please, a place to rest." Arabella's heart beat hard against her bodice. The boy's face was damp, his small fingers curled in agony, and though the man's clothes spoke of ruin, there was something in the curve of his vowels, the stillness of his eyes, that hinted at a life once lived in drawing-rooms and libraries, not alleys and rail yards. She opened the door wider. "Come in quickly!" He passed through without hesitation, stooping so as not to strike the lintel, his arms cradling the boy like a soldier carrying a wounded comrade. Arabella closed the door behind them, locking it with trembling fingers. Her breath caught as the man turned to her, and in that moment she saw the effort it took him to remain upright. "There's a small room beyond the scullery," she said, her voice low and steady. "It used to be the laundry. It's cold, but private." He nodded once. "Thank you." She led him through the back hall, careful not to let their footsteps echo. The house was quiet, but soon it would wake, and the moment this kindness was discovered, it would be taken from her, like everything else. Inside the old laundry room, the man laid the child on a folded blanket Arabella quickly placed atop the stone floor. She lit a small lamp with shaking hands, the flame flickering against the frost-lined window. The boy whimpered. Arabella knelt beside him, pressing the back of her hand to his brow. "He's burning." The man, still on one knee, looked on with helplessness that sliced deeper than any cry. "He's not spoken since yesterday." "I'll bring broth," she said, "and water. There's a small fireplace here. I'll light it." "I cannot pay you," he murmured. Arabella looked up at him. His eyes were the color of a storm, a deep, unsettled blue that revealed nothing and yet seemed to see far too much. "I didn't ask you to." His mouth pressed into a line. "Then allow me to give you at least my name, Nathaniel Gray." She paused. "Arabella Kent." He gave a slight bow of his head, though he winced from the movement. "You have my gratitude, Miss Kent." Arabella rose and moved quickly through the house, stealing broth from the kitchen before cook arrived, fetching a clean cloth from the linen cupboard and kindling a small fire in the hearth with shreds of old ledgers. All the while her chest ached, not just from the cold, but from the unfamiliar presence of a man who, for the first time in her memory, looked at her not with judgment or expectation, but need. Henry, as she learned his name to be, drifted in and out of sleep through the day. Arabella sat beside him, wiping his brow, coaxing spoonfuls of broth between his lips, whispering stories her governess once read to her long ago. Nathaniel stayed close, but at a distance, leaning against the far wall with arms folded tightly, as if restraining himself from falling apart. She dared once to look at his hands. They were not the hands of a labourer. No ink stains, no broken nails. The calluses were few. He carried his weight with poise, even in stillness. And when he finally accepted a mug of tea from her hand, their fingers brushed. It was barely a touch, yet it sparked something deep and wordless. That evening, as darkness fell and the Kent family filled the drawing room with petty gossip and clinking silver, Arabella remained by the boy's side, tucked away in the room no one had entered in years. Nathaniel watched the flames dance in the grate, his profile half-lit, weary and beautiful in its restraint. "I won't stay long," he said quietly. "Only until he's strong enough to travel." Arabella nodded. "Then rest while you can. Tomorrow will ask much of you." He looked at her then, and not with gratitude, not even with admiration, but with the aching gaze of a man who had lost everything until this moment. And though neither of them knew it yet, the frost that had gathered around their hearts began, quietly, to melt. The candlelight flickered low in the hearth's shadow, casting long golden shapes along the stone walls of the old laundry room. The scent of damp linen still clung faintly to the air, mingling now with the faint aroma of broth and burning coal. Arabella sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the rise and fall of Henry's chest as he lay nestled in blankets too large for his slight frame. His breathing had steadied, but sleep came in restless spurts, broken by half-formed dreams and small, aching whimpers. When he stirred, Arabella smoothed his hair back gently, whispering nothing but his name, like a prayer meant only to soothe. Her days, once ruled by sewing, mending hems, and keeping to the corners of drawing rooms, now revolved entirely around this quiet sanctuary where the boy slept and the man waited. Nathaniel, if that was truly his name, remained watchful, but distant. He spoke little, often choosing silence over explanation, and when he did speak, his voice carried a careful weight, as though each word had been considered twice before leaving his mouth. He rarely sat. Instead, he lingered near the small window, gazing out at the iron-grey sky with an expression unreadable to most, except perhaps to Arabella. He carried himself like a man who had once been someone else. But in the Kent household, time did not stop for sick boys or mystery guests. By the third morning, the rest of the family began to notice Arabella's absences. Her empty chair at breakfast, the way her skirts rustled past the staircase long before the household stirred, and the quiet, lingering scent of pine soap near the service entrance did not go undetected. In the breakfast parlour, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, catching on the crystal in the jam dishes. Beatrice, resplendent in a deep burgundy morning gown with black velvet trim, sipped her tea with affected delicacy, her grey eyes narrowed over the rim of her cup. "Mother," she said, her tone casual but laced with intent, "has Arabella taken ill, or is she simply avoiding company altogether?" Mrs. Kent did not look up from her correspondence. "She rises early to handle domestic matters. That should concern you only if you plan to sweep the floors yourself." Louisa gave a dainty laugh, setting down her half-eaten scone. "Perhaps she's found a stray cat to care for. She always did have a weakness for the pitiful." Beatrice's smile was sharp. "Let us hope it's only a cat." Arabella heard their words long before they were spoken to her face. The Kent household was a place of mirrors and murmurs. Whispers slid beneath doors like draughts in winter, and glances were often sharper than words. But Arabella had long ago learned to move quietly through their disdain. It wounded her, yes, but never broke her. Not since her father's death, when she first understood how invisible she had become in her own family's hierarchy. Her mother's affections had hardened into strategy. Her sisters had taken the best of everything and called it fairness, and Arabella had chosen silence until now. In the stillness of the laundry room, she read to Henry fairy tales and fables from her childhood, stories she hadn't dared revisit until they found new purpose in the fragile boy's hands. He clutched at her fingers when fever dreams rose, crying softly for a mother he no longer remembered. Arabella did not ask about the child's past. She gave comfort instead. Nathaniel watched, always just outside the circle of light. When he spoke, it was rarely about himself. But once, after a long silence, his voice broke through the hush. "You're kind to him." Arabella turned toward him slowly. "He needs kindness." He studied her then, not with flirtation, not with amusement, but with quiet intensity. Not everyone would offer it. Arabella's breath caught slightly, but she nodded. Then not everyone should have children. That look again, deep and steady, not a flicker of desire, but something far more dangerous, recognition. That same evening, as Arabella returned upstairs to fetch clean linens, she nearly collided with Mr. Norley near the front stairwell. The solicitor, tall and narrow-faced with a waxed moustache and ever-shined shoes, had long been sniffing around Beatrice like a fox circling poultry. He offered Arabella a bow that was more a flourish of pride than politeness. "Miss Kent," he said, his tone syrupy with false charm, "you appear flushed." "I've been tending to errands," she replied evenly, shifting the linens in her arms. "Ah, one wonders what manner of errands require such devotion at so early an hour." Arabella inclined her head slightly but said nothing. The solicitor took a step closer. "Rumour travels quickly in Bath," he continued, voice lower now. "There are whispers of a man seen entering this house before sunrise, a labourer with a child. Curious, don't you think?" Arabella met his gaze, her voice steady despite the chill in her chest. "Then I suggest Bath find better things to whisper about." She stepped past him before he could reply, but even as she walked away, she could feel his suspicion clinging to her like smoke. The next morning, Beatrice confronted her. Arabella had just returned from lighting the fire in the laundry room, her apron faintly singed at the hem. Beatrice stood in the hallway outside the parlour, arms crossed, her expression one of theatrical concern. "Mother is worried," she said sweetly. "You've been slipping about like a maidservant. It wouldn't do if someone thought we were running a charity." Arabella said nothing. Beatrice's voice dropped. "What did he promise you, Arabella? That if you saved his child, he'd take you away from all this?" Arabella's breath hitched, but not with shame, with anger. "He didn't promise me anything," she said softly. "That's what makes it real." She walked away, leaving Beatrice fuming behind her. Later that evening, Arabella returned to the laundry room. Henry had improved slightly. His cheeks had colour again. Nathaniel sat in the corner chair, his head tilted back against the wall, eyes closed. The lamplight traced the planes of his face, softening the exhaustion, hinting at the man beneath the shadow. Arabella set down the bowl of broth, her hand brushing the edge of his coat. He opened his eyes, and for a moment, neither of them moved. There was no touch, no words, only a silence filled with breath and firelight. The tension was not of scandal or seduction, but of two souls finding themselves side by side in a world that had given them no permission to hope. Arabella turned her gaze to the boy. Nathaniel watched her, not with expectation, but with reverence, and from beyond the door, the hallway whispered on. The city of Bath stirred beneath a veil of morning mist, soft tendrils curling around chimneys and lampposts like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release the past. The frost had begun to ease, though winter's breath still clung to the iron railings and blackened stonework. Shopkeepers lifted shutters with aching hands, and coalmen groaned under the weight of their sacks, their boots echoing across the flagstones. The world was waking, but within Arabella Kent's heart there was a stillness that had little to do with sleep. She stood in the kitchen doorway, her hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain cup, watching as Nathaniel stepped through the garden gate. He moved with quiet purpose, his long coat brushing the edges of the hedgerow, shoulders squared but tired, as if carrying the weight of a history he refused to speak aloud. He had said nothing of where he was going, only that he would return before noon. The boy still slept soundly, his cheeks pink with renewed strength, his lashes fanned over the gentle swell of youth. Arabella did not ask questions, not yet, but her heart held more than warmth now. It held doubt, and a deep, inexplicable fear. She finished her tea and began the morning's work, silent, efficient, precise. Yet even as she polished silver and folded linens, her mind wandered, to the slope of Nathaniel's shoulders beneath his wool coat, to the softness in his voice when he read aloud by lamplight, to the way his eyes had lingered on hers the night before, not boldly, but as though memorizing something too precious to speak of. An hour later, she stepped outside to air the laundry and heard her name shouted down the lane. "Miss Kent, quickly!" It was young Thomas Barrett, the baker's boy, breathless and flushed. "A gentleman's collapsed just outside the bakery near the corner. He matches the description of your guest." Arabella dropped the basket without a word. She found him slumped near the wrought iron railing outside the bakery door, one hand braced against the stone, the other curled near his ribs. His eyes were open but clouded, his skin too pale against the dark fabric of his coat. A sheen of sweat clung to his brow, and there was a tension in his jaw that spoke of pain, denied, not surrendered. "Mr. Gray," she whispered, kneeling at his side. He turned his head slowly, as though her voice alone tethered him to the world. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "I thought I would make it." She did not allow him to finish. With the help of the baker and a passing stable hand, she guided him to his feet, her hand slipping beneath his arm, steadying him. As she adjusted the collar of his coat, her fingers brushed against the inside lining, and something small and firm shifted beneath the wool. A glove, dark leather, finely stitched, the inside lined with silk. Her fingers hesitated. Her eyes caught the edge of gold thread at the cuff, an embroidered crest, a stag rampant above a twisted ribbon. Her throat tightened. She did not speak of it. She tucked it back into the coat pocket, as though it had never existed. The walk home was quiet. Nathaniel leaned heavily on her, his silence heavy with shame, but Arabella said nothing. Her heart was loud in her ears, beating with a rhythm of questions she could not yet bear to ask. Back in the laundry room, she brought him water, placed a compress at his brow, and stoked the fire with more urgency than usual. He rested with his eyes closed, the lines at the corners of his mouth deeper now, carved by secrets rather than time. Henry stirred then, his voice still hoarse but filled with childish relief. "Papa." Nathaniel opened his eyes. "I'm here, Henry." Arabella stepped aside, folding the compress into the basin, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Later that afternoon, with the boy once more asleep and Nathaniel resting under the thin warmth of a patched quilt, Arabella slipped outside to gather rosemary from the garden bed. The winter had been unkind to the herbs, but a few sprigs remained, enough to steep into a tonic that might ease Nathaniel's aching muscles. She stood near the hedgerow, clippers in hand, when a soft rumble caught her attention. A carriage turned the corner at the far end of the street, black, gleaming, drawn by two bay horses of impressive stature. The crest on its door caught the weak sunlight, a stag rampant, precisely like the one embroidered into the glove. Arabella's breath faltered. The driver, a broad man in a fine wool coat, met her gaze as the carriage passed, and he tipped his hat, not to her, to the house behind her, to him. Arabella remained perfectly still, the cold air pinching her skin. That night, As she folded fresh linens in the quiet of the upstairs corridor, Louisa appeared at her side, a silk dressing gown wrapped tightly around her narrow frame. Her hair was pinned with lavender ribbons, her eyes bright with calculation, but for once her voice lacked its usual edge. "You've changed." Arabella did not pause. "Have I? There's colour in your cheeks, and something else, as though you carry a secret no one can touch." Arabella looked at her then, truly looked. Louisa's beauty was untouched, her hands still soft from a life that had never asked her to serve, and yet there was something hollow in her gaze, a longing perhaps, or envy carefully masked. Louisa sighed, her voice softer now. "Be careful, Arabella. People talk." "I know." Louisa hesitated, then reached out to smooth the edge of a folded sheet. "I don't think you're foolish. I think you feel things more than the rest of us." Arabella said nothing. But when Louisa walked away, her heart was not untouched. Later, after Henry had been tucked into his makeshift bed and Nathaniel had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, Arabella sat alone in the small chair by the hearth. She pulled the glove from her apron pocket. She had not meant to keep it. She traced the embroidery with trembling fingers. The gold threads shimmered faintly in the firelight, regal and undeniable. A crest such as this did not belong to a clerk, nor to a man with no name. She folded it once, then again, and tucked it into the drawer beneath the basin, and though the fire still burned, the chill that crept through the room was not from the cold. It was from the realization that nothing was as it seemed. The winter evening settled over Bath with an air of expectation. Fog curled low around the stone buildings, like a silken shawl draped across the city's shoulders, and golden light spilled from the tall windows of the Kent townhouse onto the damp street below. The drawing-room had been transformed. Wax candles in silver sconces burned high on the walls, casting warm flickers across the polished floors. The pianoforte stood open and gleaming beneath a lace-draped gaslight, and the scent of orange peels and mulled wine clung to the air with festive insistence. Beatrice had orchestrated the evening with her usual precision, down to the colour of the ribbons adorning the backs of the chairs. Her gown, deep emerald satin with black lace trim, had been chosen not only for elegance, but for the message it conveyed: power and restraint, wealth and taste. She had spent the entire week rehearsing her smile in the hallway mirror, adjusting its softness by degrees, depending on whether she addressed a gentleman of property or one merely of means. Louisa flitted between guests like a moth drawn to flickering conversation. Her gown was palest lilac, the colour of fading violets, and her curls had been set with lavender oil, releasing a scent with every passing gesture. She laughed often, though the laughter rarely reached her eyes. Arabella wore grey, not the cool grey of slate or pearl, but the modest, unremarkable grey of usefulness. Her gown, several seasons old and carefully mended, bore no embellishment save a small ribbon at the neckline, and her sleeves were rolled just high enough to show she had been working in the kitchens earlier that day. She carried the tray of punch with quiet efficiency, her shoulders straight, her gaze low. She did not belong to the gathering. She served it. The room was filled with the sounds of strings and polite laughter. The gentlemen of Bath, dressed in dark coats and satin waistcoats, exchanged pleasantries with gloved hands and half-formed intentions. Conversation floated like perfume, layered and sweet, but often cloying. Arabella moved between them unnoticed, her tray steady, her heart less so. It was Mr. Norley who intercepted her near the sideboard, his narrow frame blocking her path as he reached for a cup. "My dear Miss Kent," he said smoothly, accepting the glass she handed him. "You carry yourself with such quiet dignity tonight, so rare in younger women." She gave him the smallest of nods. "You're too kind." His lips curved into what he no doubt believed was a charming smile. "But then again, some things about your household are not so quiet, are they?" Arabella paused. I'm not sure I understand. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. One hears rumors, Miss Kent, about strange men appearing at servant entrances, about children with uncertain parentage, about young ladies offering sanctuary without permission. Arabella met his gaze, her pulse quickening. One hears many things, Mr. Norley. It doesn't make them true. Quite right, he murmured. Though I've found that truth often arrives clothed in the garments of scandal, particularly in a city as small as this. She forced a smile and stepped back. Excuse me, I believe Miss Holloway has asked for more punch. She turned and walked away without waiting for his reply, her breath shallow, her fingers tightening around the empty tray. The music had changed, a waltz now, and couples were beginning to move about the floor with measured grace. Beatrice held court at the edge of the pianoforte, her laughter floating higher than the melody. Louisa was being spun by a gentleman in blue, her skirts trailing like petals in water. Arabella disappeared into the shadows beyond the hallway arch, her heart thudding not from Mr. Norley's veiled threat, but from the doubt he had planted. Doubt that had already been stirring quietly beneath her surface. She slipped away from the parlor altogether, making her way to the back staircase, where the hum of music dulled into a distant tremor. She moved silently, her slippers barely whispering against the worn carpet. The kitchen was warm, still scented faintly with roasting chestnuts and cinnamon, and dimly lit by the glow of a single oil lamp on the hearth. Nathaniel stood there, facing the fire. She froze at the threshold. He had removed his coat, the sleeves of his shirt rolled just above his wrists. His posture, though still proud, had softened in the solitude. The firelight played across the angles of his face, illuminating the planes of cheek and jaw, the faint furrow between his brows. "You should be upstairs," he said without turning. "Isn't tonight your sister's grand affair?" She stepped into the room. "It's not mine." At that, he looked over his shoulder. His eyes were tired but clear, and something within them shifted when he saw her, something small, almost imperceptible, like the flicker of a candle against glass. He turned fully, crossing the room to stand nearer the hearth, his voice low. "I thought it best not to intrude. The boy's asleep. The night is long." Arabella moved closer, standing on the opposite side of the fire. The silence between them was tender but taut, like a thread pulled to the edge of breaking. "I spoke with Mr. Norley," she said softly. "He seems to believe you're something you're not." Nathaniel's expression remained still, unreadable. "Is he right?" she asked. A pause. Then, "Does it matter?" "It might," she whispered. "To others." He exhaled through his nose, stepping toward her, slow and deliberate. "I once belonged to a world," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "that measured a man by the width of his land and the shine of his boots. That world saw me as something I never agreed to be. I lost too much there, and I left." Arabella held his gaze, her breath uneven. "Did you lose your name as well?" A long silence stretched between them. Nathaniel did not answer, but his eyes held hers with such intensity that words became unnecessary. There was truth in them, if not the whole truth, then the shadow of it, and in that shadow Arabella saw pain. He took one step closer. Her hand trembled slightly at her side. He noticed, and slowly, tentatively, he reached out and brushed his fingers against hers. Just once. Just enough. The contact was fleeting, delicate, but in that brief touch lived the weight of everything they had not said. And then he pulled away, not with rejection, but restraint. Arabella lowered her eyes. He spoke again, softly. "If I had met you in another life, Miss Kent, I might have offered you more than mystery." She looked up, and though her lips did not move, her eyes answered him. "In another life, or perhaps still in this one." Neither of them spoke as she turned and walked away. But long after she had gone, Nathaniel remained before the hearth, watching the flames fade into coals, the memory of her touch lingering like the last warmth of firelight. The morning began in silence, with snow falling in slow, graceful spirals over the rooftops of Bath. The city wore its winter like a lace shawl, delicate and pale, as though all harshness had been muted by the hush of white. Arabella stood at the parlour window, the hem of her apron dusted with flour from the bread she had left rising in the scullery. Her gaze wandered not toward the gardens or the clouds, but inward, into the heavy stillness that had taken residence inside her chest. Mrs. Kent's voice pierced the quiet like the cold. "Arabella," she called from the doorway, holding an envelope between gloved fingers. "Since you seem to have time for roaming about, you may deliver this for me." Arabella turned slowly, taking the letter without comment. "To Bransmore House," her mother added, eyeing her closely. "It is for Lady Ashcombe's companion, Miss Mowbray. Do try not to fumble the task. The household is of considerable importance." Arabella lowered her eyes and nodded. The name, Bransmore, settled in her stomach like a stone. She wrapped herself in her plain cloak, pulled her bonnet tight beneath her chin, and stepped into the snow. The walk was not long, but it felt endless. The city passed her in slow motion, shutters opening, chimneys breathing smoke, children pressing footprints into the fresh powder. Yet Arabella felt she was not walking toward a door, but toward a truth she had tried to silence with every quiet hour by the fire. Bransmore House rose before her like a memory half remembered. It was grand without ornamentation, its columns swept clean of snow by unseen hands, its windows reflecting the pale sky above. The gates stood open. A servant with a blue sash greeted her with a nod and led her around the side entrance to a smaller corridor reserved for deliveries and quiet arrivals. Miss Mowbray received her with practiced politeness, her pale features unreadable. "I'll see that Lady Ashcombe receives it," she said simply, tucking the note into a side table. Arabella turned to go, but as she stepped back into the corridor, a low voice floated from the adjacent hallway. "I told you to cancel the shipment. The red wool was never approved for the library." It was a man's voice, firm, articulate, laced with authority. Arabella froze. The steward answered, his tone deferential. "Yes, my lord. I'll see to it immediately." And then, his footsteps. Arabella turned her head slightly and saw him. Nathaniel, not Mr. Grey, not the silent man by the hearth, but Nathaniel Ashcombe, the Earl of Bransmore. He was dressed in a formal frock coat of black wool, the lapels stiff, the cuffs brushed with velvet. A gold watch chain glinted faintly at his waist. His shoulders were straighter here, his voice sharper, and the man who had once knelt beside a sick child now moved like someone who owned the ground beneath his feet. He did not see her. He turned into another room, leaving only the echo of his voice in the hallway. Arabella stood motionless, her hands still wrapped around the edge of her cloak. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply turned and walked back into the snow. The wind stung her cheeks as she crossed the square, but she welcomed it. It made her feel something, anything, besides the ache blooming in her chest. She walked faster, her boots crunching against the frozen path, her breath shallow as she reached the Kent townhouse. Inside, the world carried on. Beatrice was seated at the writing desk, composing yet another letter to some unsuspecting suitor. Louisa hummed softly as she examined a new hair ribbon. Mrs. Kent inspected the silverware for tarnish. Arabella passed them unnoticed, the snow melting into the hem of her cloak. She entered the laundry room without a word. The fire had burned low. The boy's bed was empty. Henry had gone upstairs to rest at Nathaniel's suggestion. The room smelled of lavender and ash. Arabella crossed to the wooden chair and sat. She reached into the drawer where she had once hidden the glove and pulled out something else, a scarf. It was soft, warm, and faded at the edges. He had left it behind the first time he collapsed. She had kept it without thinking, without intention. Now, she fed it to the fire. The wool curled in the flames, catching slowly at first, then igniting with a sudden crackle. Arabella did not look away. She watched until the scarf was nothing but blackened threads and a faint trail of smoke curling toward the chimney. Behind her, the door creaked. Beatrice stood on the threshold, arms folded, brows lifted in mock curiosity. "Cleaning, dear sister?" she asked. "Or burying something?" Arabella did not answer. Beatrice's gaze drifted toward the hearth, then narrowed. Was that a man's scarf? Arabella's silence was answer enough. Beatrice's lips parted slightly. Her expression sharpened, not with mockery but calculation. She stepped into the room, eyes flicking to the drawer left ajar. And there, something caught her attention. She reached in and pulled out the glove Arabella had forgotten to remove. Her fingers turned it over slowly, studying the embroidery. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and deliberate. "Where did you get this?" Arabella rose quickly, but Beatrice held the glove away from her reach. "This isn't a tradesman's glove," Beatrice said, now circling Arabella like a hawk. "It's handmade. Look at the stitching, gold thread, a crest." Arabella's voice trembled. "Give it back." But Beatrice only smiled, her expression tight with knowing. "You should have destroyed this too." She placed the glove in her pocket and turned. As she walked away, her voice drifted back through the open doorway. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Arabella. I wonder what would happen if Mother knew you'd been sheltering a man of title without telling her." Arabella sank back into the chair, her hands still shaking. Outside, the snow fell heavier, muffling the city beneath its weight. Inside, a storm far colder had begun to stir. The morning light came reluctantly, as though even the sun hesitated to disturb what the night had undone. Arabella stood at the edge of the garden, her boots damp with frost, the shawl around her shoulders doing little to stop the cold that had settled inside her. The air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and wet earth. From a distance the city seemed quiet, softened by fog, but within her everything churned with questions that refused to be silenced. She had not slept. Not after seeing him, Nathaniel, there in that corridor of Bransmore House, speaking with authority, dressed not in the worn coat of a clerk, but in the regal restraint of a nobleman. The truth had not come as thunder, but as a whisper that cut deeper than any scream, and yet even now she longed for his voice, for the weight of his eyes on hers, for the fire-lit stillness of the room they had shared in secret. She longed to believe that what she had felt, what she had begun to trust, had not been a lie. The door creaked behind her. She turned slowly. He stood there, not in finery, not in shadows, just Nathaniel. The same weary strength in his shoulders, the same solemn grief in his eyes, but now there was no hiding. "May I speak with you?" he asked. Arabella nodded, her hands clutching the edge of her shawl. They walked together in silence to the old stone bench beneath the barren pear tree. The garden, though small, held the scent of another season, the memory of spring buried under frost. Nathaniel sat beside her, though not too close. "I should have told you," he said softly, "from the first moment, but I was afraid that if I did, you would see only the title, the scandal, the weight of everything I tried to leave behind." Arabella's voice was quiet. "Then who have I been speaking to all this time? The man in the shadows, or the Earl of Bransmore?" His jaw tightened, but not in anger, in shame. "Both," he answered, "though I confess, I would give anything to be only the former." She looked at him then, fully. "Tell me the truth, all of it." He inhaled slowly, as if gathering fragments long buried. "My wife, Eleanor, died 2 years ago under circumstances that were never fully explained. She fell from the balcony of our summer estate. There were rumors of grief, of madness, of affairs, and letters, whispers in the House of Lords, where I had once made enemies. Her death became more than a tragedy. It became political currency. I was accused of negligence, of cruelty. Some said it was I who pushed her." Arabella's breath caught. "I didn't," he said firmly, eyes searching hers. "But in those weeks that followed, I lost everything, friends, reputation, safety. There were threats against Henry, against me, so I left. I disappeared with my son. I took the name of my mother's family, Grey, and I wandered until I found a place that was quiet enough to let him breathe again. That's all I wanted, Arabella. Peace, not deception. She stared down at her hands, the pale skin of her knuckles white from tension. I would have understood, she whispered, if you had told me. I know, he said. That is what haunts me most. A long silence stretched between them. The tree above them shook faintly in the wind, releasing a single brown leaf that drifted down to rest at her feet. I don't know if I can trust what I felt anymore, she said at last. Every kindness, every look, every silence, it feels changed, as though I was speaking to a stranger and calling it closeness. Nathaniel nodded once, slowly. I don't ask for your forgiveness now, only your understanding. Arabella rose gently from the bench. Her heart ached with the desire to reach for him, to cradle the pain in his voice and tell him it had not all been in vain. But she couldn't, not yet. I need time, she said. He bowed his head in solemn respect. Take all you need. That evening, the fire crackled low in the laundry room. Henry slept soundly, his dreams finally free of fever. Arabella sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the blanket, as though her presence alone might protect him from a world that had already taken too much. She had not noticed the faint creak upstairs, had not heard the slow steps down the hall. Beatrice moved like a shadow when she wished to, and tonight she did. Arabella had left the small drawer slightly ajar. The glove still rested there, carefully folded beside 2 worn letters Nathaniel had left behind during the weeks he stayed hidden. Notes requesting herbs for Henry, a poem scribbled on the back of an old envelope, the remnants of something tender and unspoken. Beatrice's eyes gleamed as she lifted them one by one. The gold thread in the glove shimmered under the lamp. The letters, though brief, bore the unmistakable hand of a man educated beyond clerkdom. And more importantly, they bore affection. She didn't burn them at once. She read them twice. Then, with precision born of vanity, she stepped to the hearth and fed the flame. The paper curled. The glove blackened at the edges. The scent of smoke lifted into the air, heavy with the ghost of words no longer spoken. Beatrice turned to her own desk, where fresh parchment awaited. The letter she composed was elegant, polite, almost affectionate. It was addressed to Sir Lucian Brandeth, a rival of the Ashcombe family, a man known more for his appetite for vengeance than his regard for manners. She offered delicately her company and cooperation in exchange for clarification. She inquired after the details of Eleanor Ashcombe's death. She hinted at knowledge of Nathaniel's whereabouts, and she signed the letter with her full name in ink dark as her ambition. When she finished, she sealed it with her personal crest and slipped it beneath her cloak. The maid would deliver it in the morning. She returned to her room without a sound. Arabella sat by the dying fire, unaware that the ashes beneath the grate no longer belonged only to logs and kindling, but to the last fragments of trust she had once folded and kept safe. Outside, the snow began again, silent, slow, and relentless. A blanket too soft to stop what was already in motion. The silence of his absence was heavier than any word he had ever spoken. 3 days had passed since Nathaniel had last been seen at the Kent townhouse, and by the 4th his presence had become a memory that no one dared name aloud. He had left no letter, no farewell, no promise of return. Only a small indentation remained on the pillow where he had once rested beside the hearth, and a faint echo of footsteps that Arabella could still hear in the early morning hours, when the rest of the house slept and she sat alone in the quiet, holding her breath against the growing ache in her chest. Rumours rose like mist from the cobbled streets of Bath. Whispers spoke of a carriage that departed in the dead of night, of a man with noble eyes and a hidden past returning to claim what was once his in London. Some said he had abandoned his child to save his title. Others, with less mercy, said he had deceived a modest girl with the elegance of a lie dressed in charity. Arabella did not answer the whispers. She simply vanished from the places where they lived. With Henry in her arms and sorrow in her soul, she slipped through the back streets toward the edge of the city, where Mrs. Holloway's cottage sat, nestled behind a crumbling stone wall, half forgotten by time and society. The old woman welcomed her without question. No words were needed between women who had shared the weight of too many silences. Henry's condition had worsened again. The brightness that had bloomed in his cheeks after weeks of care faded under the weight of fever and confusion. He clung to Arabella as he had in the beginning, whimpering for his father in restless sleep. She stayed at his side, washing his face with cool cloths, whispering stories, humming lullabies she barely remembered from her own childhood. She never spoke Nathaniel's name aloud, but it lived in her every movement. It was the 5th morning, grey and windless, when the messenger arrived. A boy no older than 10 stood at the garden gate with a sealed envelope and a solemn expression that did not belong to his youth. He extended the parchment with trembling fingers. "For Miss Arabella Kent," he said. Arabella took it, her hands already cold before she broke the seal. The ink was dark, the tone legal, the words cut with precision. She was to appear before the local magistrate the following morning on charges of impropriety and manipulation of a titled man under false pretenses. It was worded with the civility of law, but the intention was unmistakable. She was being summoned to defend her reputation or watch it collapse entirely. Mrs. Holloway's voice shook with fury. "They've no proof, no grounds. This is filth." Arabella folded the letter carefully, placing it beneath the boy's pillow. "I have no choice," she said softly. "If I don't go, the silence will decide the matter for me." That night, as the snow returned, Arabella remained awake beside Henry's bed, her fingers brushing back his damp curls. Her eyes did not close, not even when the candle burned low and the wind whispered through the shutters like a breath on her neck. She rose before dawn and dressed in her plainest gown, a deep navy wool with a high collar and no adornment. Her hair was pinned back tightly, her gloves clean but mended at the seams. She looked as she always had, like a girl no one noticed. But inside her, something had changed. She walked to the courthouse alone. The room was small, panelled in dark wood, with windows that let in only a cold, indifferent light. The magistrate, a stern man with a grey beard and an impatient stare, sat behind a raised bench. The audience was sparse but eager. Mrs. Kent, seated rigidly in the second row, Beatrice beside her with an expression of faint amusement. Mr. Day. Norley stood near the aisle, his cravat impeccable, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. Louisa, noticeably paler than usual, looked everywhere but at her sister. Arabella stood before them all, hands clasped, heart steady. The charges were read aloud in a voice too loud for the intimacy of the room, that she had harbored a man of noble blood under false pretenses, that she had used proximity and kindness to manipulate his affections, that she had attempted to advance her position through deceit. She said nothing. The magistrate leaned forward. "Do you wish to respond to these accusations, Miss Kent?" Arabella lifted her chin, her voice clear and unshaken. "No, not yet." The door at the back of the room opened. Gasps rose like wind through dry leaves. He entered as if the world itself had parted to make way for him. Nathaniel Ashcombe, the Earl of Bransmoor, stood tall and unyielding in the doorway, dressed in a black frock coat with silver buttons, a navy waistcoat, and a snow-dusted cloak draped across his shoulders. His boots echoed against the floor as he strode forward, removing his gloves with precise calm. Every eye in the room turned to him, but he looked only at Arabella. "I will speak," he said, his voice carrying like thunder softened by velvet. The magistrate, startled but intrigued, gave a nod. Nathaniel stepped beside Arabella, his presence both armor and fire. "These accusations," he said, "are born not of justice, but of jealousy. Miss Kent neither pursued me nor asked anything of me. I sought her company. I placed my son in her care. I hid my name not to deceive her, but to escape the cruelty of those who exploited my tragedy for gain." He turned toward Beatrice. "And one of those persons is seated in this room." A hush fell so deep it trembled. Nathaniel withdrew a folded letter from the inside of his coat. "This," he continued, "was sent by Miss Beatrice Kent to Sir Lucian Brandeth, a known political adversary of mine. In it, she offers information regarding my location and seeks to exchange her silence for scandalous details about my late wife's death. I have the letter because Sir Lucian, in his own peculiar sense of justice, forwarded it to me." He handed the letter to the magistrate, who examined it with rising discomfort. Nathaniel's voice softened. "Arabella Kent is the only soul who offered me kindness when I had nothing to offer in return. She asked for no title, no future, no promises, and it is I who must ask forgiveness for placing her in harm's way." The silence that followed was total. Mr. Norley stepped back, his mouth tightening. Beatrice, exposed, turned her face slightly, but the colour had drained from her cheeks. Mrs. Kent sat frozen, her lips thin, her spine ramrod straight. The magistrate cleared his throat, the letter still in his hands. "These proceedings are concluded. Miss Kent is absolved of all accusations." Arabella did not speak. She merely looked at Nathaniel, her eyes shining with something that was not triumph, but something far more sacred: recognition. Outside, the snow had stopped, but within the walls of that room, a storm had passed, leaving in its wake not destruction, but clarity. And in the ruin of Beatrice's carefully constructed world, Arabella had risen, not as a daughter of quiet obedience, but as a woman whose dignity had been tested and found unbreakable. The carriage arrived just after noon, its wheels hushed by a fresh dusting of snow. No announcement, no footman, no envelope sealed in wax. Only a familiar vehicle pulled by a pair of black horses, their breath rising in ghostly plumes as they waited at the end of the Kent lane. The driver said nothing. He merely extended a gloved hand, and in his palm lay the token Arabella had not dared to expect. The glove, restored, restitched, whole. Its leather was darker now, polished to a shine, and the gold embroidery of the Ashcombe crest shimmered in the weak winter sun. It was no longer the weathered remnant she had once hidden in the drawer beneath the basin. This was the same glove, but transformed, like everything else. Arabella's fingers trembled as she took it. The coachman bowed slightly. "His lordship awaits you at Bransmoor." And then he turned, returning to the driver's seat, leaving her standing at the garden gate with her heart thrumming in her throat. She did not ask permission, not from her mother, not from her sisters. She simply gathered her shawl, fastened her cloak, and stepped into the carriage. The road to Bransmoor was quiet, lined with skeletal trees whose bare branches swayed in the wind like ink strokes against the pale sky. Arabella sat in silence, the glove still resting on her lap. It no longer frightened her. What frightened her was the feeling that bloomed in her chest, a mix of longing, grief, and something so close to hope that it made her breath come shallow. Bransmoor House emerged through the trees, its stone facade solemn, windows tall and expressionless. It was not grand in the ostentatious way of new wealth, but proud, like a nobleman in mourning. The gates stood open. The gravel path was swept. The world, it seemed, had been waiting for her. The footman led her not to the grand hall, but through the garden entrance at the rear of the estate. Arabella followed in silence, her boots whispering across flagstone, her pulse loud in her ears. They passed beneath an ivy-covered arch, through a narrow passage that smelled faintly of cedar and frost, and then she saw him. Nathaniel stood in the lower courtyard, beneath the tall library window, where, weeks ago, she had first glimpsed him in his true form. The snow had settled softly on the edges of the balustrade, and the air between them was filled with a silence that was not empty, but expectant. He turned as she entered the space. No coat, no gloves. Just his waistcoat and open frock coat, as if to make himself vulnerable to the wind. or to her? Arabella stopped at the threshold. Their eyes met. "I didn't include a note," he said, voice low, "because anything written would have fallen short." She took a slow breath. "And yet you sent something." His gaze dropped briefly to the glove in her hands. "I thought perhaps the first thing I left behind should also be the first to return." Arabella said nothing. Nathaniel took one step forward, then another. "I wanted to see you here," he continued, "in the place where I was forced to become the man you met, and where I now wish to become the man you deserve." Arabella lowered her eyes for only a moment, as if to steady herself against the weight of the words. Nathaniel's voice softened. "I deceived you out of fear, but I loved you out of truth." Her heart clenched at the sound of the word. "I never planned to love again," he said. "After Eleanor, I believed myself unworthy of peace. But you brought silence into my storm. You loved my son before you ever looked at me, and when the world came for you, it found a woman who stood taller than I ever did." Arabella raised her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "And now?" He reached into his coat and removed a small velvet pouch. He did not kneel. He did not hold it out like a bargain. He simply placed it gently on the stone railing between them. "I'm not asking you to enter my world," he said. "I'm asking you to let me build a new one with you." She stared at the pouch, untouched. Nathaniel stepped back. "I'll wait," he said, "as long as it takes." And with that, he turned and walked into the house, leaving her alone beneath the high windows and falling snow. Arabella stood motionless. Her breath came in soft clouds. Then, slowly, she picked up the pouch and slipped it into her cloak without opening it. She wandered through the lower gardens for what felt like hours. The snow was gentle now, dusting the hedges and stone fountains with a quiet elegance. Every path she followed led her deeper into the estate's winter hush. Her boots left delicate prints behind her, but she did not look back. She passed rows of rose bushes, asleep for the season, their thorns blackened, their stems brittle with frost. She passed the glass conservatory, its windows glowing with trapped sunlight and green promise. And then she reached the orchard, bare and solemn, where a single bench rested beneath an old yew tree. She sat. Her hands were cold, but her heart was burning. This place was not the world she had come from. It was not the kitchen with its chipped cups, nor the corridors filled with her sister's whispers. It was not even the small stone bench in Mrs. Holloway's garden, where Henry had once clung to her scarf with tiny, fevered fingers. It was new, terrifying, vast. Could she belong here? Could she step into a life that bore not only his name, but his past? She closed her eyes and saw herself, not as she had been, but as she had become. The girl who had defied her mother for a stranger at the servants' entrance. The woman who had spoken with dignity before a room of men waiting to see her fall. The heart that had opened despite every warning. She stood. The wind caught the edge of her cloak, and the snow danced around her like confetti at a forgotten celebration. Her steps, though light, no longer hesitated. She did not knock when she reached the door. The butler opened it before her hand reached the knocker, as though the house itself had known. He led her not to a drawing room, nor a parlour, but to the library, where the fire was lit and the air smelled of cedar and leather-bound books. Nathaniel stood by the window. He turned. She met his gaze, and said nothing. But her hands reached forward and placed the glove gently on the nearest table. "I've come to build something," she said. His breath caught. "With you," she added. The fire crackled softly behind them, and though no vow was spoken, the room brimmed with the quiet certainty of a life just beginning to unfold. The Kent household had never been a quiet one, but on that morning, silence reigned like a storm waiting to strike. Arabella stood in the entry hall with her gloves in hand, her bonnet askew from the wind, and the faintest trace of mud clinging to the hem of her walking boots. The brass clock above the mantel ticked with merciless precision, each second a warning. She had returned to face judgment, not from a court of law, but from the family that had never truly seen her. Mrs. Kent appeared first, her face pale with fury, as though the mere sight of Arabella shattered whatever fragile control she still possessed. "So," she said coldly, stepping down from the stairwell like a queen stripped of her throne, "you return, not with shame, but with what? Triumph. Do not expect this house to welcome disgrace." Arabella held her posture, her fingers steady even as her heart beat painfully against her ribs. "I have come only to collect what is mine." "What is yours?" Beatrice's voice cut through the tension like a poisoned blade. She emerged from the drawing room with her hair pinned too tightly and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You mean the Earl? Or the pity of Bath's gossips? Do not mistake curiosity for respect, Arabella." Arabella turned toward her sister slowly. "I mistook nothing," she said, "not even your cruelty." Beatrice flushed, but it was Louisa who interrupted, appearing timidly at the foot of the stairs, with her hands clasped and her eyes red-rimmed. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I never meant for it to go so far." Arabella blinked. "What do you mean?" Louisa swallowed hard, her gaze flickering to Beatrice before settling on Arabella. "The letters. I didn't burn them. I couldn't. I only hid them beneath the loose floorboard in my wardrobe. I thought if you left, if you married him, I didn't want you to look back and regret us." A hush fell over the room. Even Mrs. Kent seemed caught off guard by Louisa's confession. Arabella's breath caught as she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her youngest sister. Louisa leaned into the embrace with the desperation of someone who had carried too much silence. "Thank you," Arabella whispered, "for protecting a part of me I thought lost." When she stepped away, there were no further words. Not for Mrs. Kent, whose mouth quivered in restrained rage, nor for Beatrice, who stood as stiff as a statue carved in envy and disbelief. Arabella lifted her chin, picked up her valise, and walked out the front door without another glance. The cold met her like an old companion, but for the first time, it did not bite. The journey to Bransmoor was quiet, the wheels of the carriage creaking as the snow gave way to patches of early thaw. The sky above was pale, the faintest hue of blue peeking through winter's stubborn hold. She pressed her gloved hand to the window, watching the trees blur past in muted greys and silvers. When she arrived at the estate gates, she asked the driver to stop. "I'd like to walk the rest," she said. The driver nodded, and she stepped out into the gravel path, her boots crunching softly with each step. The world smelled of thawing earth and distant smoke. As she crested the final hill before the manor, she saw him. Henry stood first, holding a bundle of wild dandelions in fists too small to grasp them properly. The yellow blossoms drooped slightly, as if aware of their imperfection, but Arabella felt her throat tighten all the same. "Miss Bella," he called, his voice shrill with joy. She crouched down instinctively as he ran into her arms, burying his face into her coat. "I picked these for you," he mumbled. "I tried not to squish them." "They're perfect," she whispered, clutching him close. When she looked up, Nathaniel stood several paces away, not in his noble trappings, but in the simple attire of the man she had once sheltered, a wool coat, unadorned cravat, and boots dulled by dust. He looked older somehow, and yet the same. The weariness that once clung to him had given way to a quiet peace, one that shimmered faintly behind his eyes. She rose slowly, brushing hair from her face as Henry scampered back toward the house, already distracted by the sound of geese in the rear paddock. Arabella met Nathaniel's gaze. He did not speak at first, only approached. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness again," he said gently, "and I didn't dress as a lord because I don't want to be one in this moment. I want to be the man who stood outside your door, desperate and unseen, and found not charity, but honor and tenderness." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. "And I am no longer the girl who needed to ask permission to be kind." The wind stirred, catching a strand of hair and lifting it across her cheek. He stepped closer, slowly, carefully, as if afraid the moment might break. "I would like to live a life beside you." he said. "Without ceremony, without titles, without anyone else's permission. I don't need your answer spoken to a room full of nobles. I need it here, now." Arabella swallowed, her heart aching with the weight of it all, of the girl who had once whispered lullabies to a fevered child in secret, who had felt invisible at her own hearth, who had loved quietly and without hope. "I can't promise I'll always feel strong," she murmured. "I know," he replied. "I can't promise I'll fit into your world. Then I'll shape mine around you." She closed the space between them and reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined without need for permission. No announcement was made, no trumpet sounded, but in that breathless hush they spoke all that mattered. "Yes," she whispered. He smiled then, and in that smile was every vow she would ever need. Later that evening, Arabella stood alone in the garden just behind the house. The sun had begun its descent, streaking the sky with gold and lavender. She wore a simple woolen shawl, and the faintest scent of lavender clung to her hair. Snowdrops bloomed at the foot of the trees, heralding the coming of spring. She looked down at her gloved hands. Soon she would have to choose a gown, not one that would dazzle society, but one that would honor her journey. Something soft, something enduring, sage for healing, ash for all that she had shed. Behind her the windows of Bransmore glowed with warm light. But she did not turn just yet. For now she let the dusk wrap around her like an old lullaby, and allowed herself to feel chosen, not for her name, not for her obedience, but for her heart. And when she turned back to the house, she walked not as a girl dismissed, but as a woman claimed. The hills above Bath had turned green again, as though winter had never bruised them. A haze of wild violets blanketed the slopes, their tender petals trembling beneath the breeze. The morning sky hung low with soft clouds, promising rain that would fall not as punishment, but as blessing. At the top of the hill, nestled between two ancient yews, stood a modest stone chapel with ivy curled around its weather-worn arch. It was no cathedral. There were no heralds, no velvet-lined pews, no organ thunder. But there was sunlight caught in dew, birdsong woven through silence, and the hush of breath held in reverence. Inside the chapel, the scent of lavender and beeswax lingered. Simple ribbons adorned the ends of the benches, no grandeur, only sincerity. The guests, few and hand-picked, sat in quiet anticipation, their voices low and reverent. In the front row, Mrs. Holloway sat with her hands folded tightly, a lavender sprig tucked into the brim of her bonnet. When Arabella entered, the room seemed to inhale with her. Her gown was unlike any worn by a countess before her. No satin, no pearls, no trailing embroidery meant to dazzle dukes and debutantes. The bodice hugged her gently in sage silk, and the skirts flowed in layers of ash-grey tulle, shifting like dusk mist as she walked. The colours spoke not of wealth, but of a journey survived, of wounds tended, of innocence shed and soul restored. Her hair was drawn up with care, but left soft at the crown, where a few wisps curled rebelliously. Her only adornment was a small silver pin at her temple, a gift from Henry, who had insisted she wear it because it sparkled like her eyes. It was Mrs. Holloway who took her hand. "You deserve this," she whispered, her eyes shining, "and he deserves you." Arabella nodded, her throat too tight for words. Together they stepped through the chapel door, where the light filtered through stained glass, painting pale roses across the aisle. At the altar, Nathaniel stood waiting. His coat was charcoal, tailored yet unassuming, with a waistcoat in slate grey and a single violet pinned to his lapel. He did not wear a coronet or carry the weight of his title. He stood simply as a man in love, his eyes following Arabella's every step as if she were the only thing in the world that could hold his heart still. Henry stood beside him, proudly clutching a satin pillow with trembling hands. The rings, two simple bands of white gold, rested atop, tied with a strip of linen that once belonged to Nathaniel's late wife's handkerchief, now repurposed with reverence and hope. Arabella reached the front and took Nathaniel's hand. For a long moment they did not speak. They only looked at each other, the chapel falling away behind them, the flowers, the guests, the spring breeze. All of it dimmed beneath the glow of that gaze. The officiant's voice broke the silence gently, inviting them to speak their vows. Not the elaborate lines, scripted for nobility, but words of their own choosing. "I vow," Nathaniel said, voice steady though his hand trembled slightly, "to see you, not as society names you, nor as your family once measured you, but as you are, strong, tender, unflinching in love and mercy." Arabella's lips parted, and her voice came, low and unwavering. "I vow to walk beside you, not in your shadow nor in your light alone, but as a woman who chose, freely, fully, to stand where love asked her to stand." Henry sniffled behind them, prompting a ripple of affectionate laughter. As the final words were spoken and the rings exchanged, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft, warm, and sparse, like heaven's quiet benediction. Arabella tilted her face upward, allowing it to wash over her, not as a ruin, but as renewal. The bell tower above them began to toll. One chime, then two. Then a cascade of sound that echoed across the hills, startling birds into flight and drawing the eyes of farmers in the valley below. It was not the call of grandeur. It was the echo of change. Outside, the chapel steps glistened with rain. Arabella and Nathaniel emerged beneath a canopy of shared umbrellas and laughter. Henry ran ahead, spinning in circles, arms outstretched. Mrs. Holloway dabbed her eyes and declared the rain good luck from the heavens. At the edge of the crowd, standing beneath a solitary birch tree, Louisa watched. Her gown was pale green, a shade too modest for a celebration, and her hands twisted the handkerchief in her lap with unconscious rhythm. Her eyes followed her sister not with envy, but with something gentler, wonder perhaps, a kind of mourning too, for chances not taken, for words she should have spoken sooner. Arabella caught her gaze and, without hesitation, crossed the wet grass until they stood face to face. "Thank you," Louisa said softly, voice breaking. Arabella reached out and drew her into an embrace. "It's never too late," she whispered. They parted with no need for more. The celebration that followed was modest and full of warmth. Inside Bransmore's drawing room, the hearth crackled, casting golden light across smiling faces. A lemon cake, baked by Mrs. Holloway herself, stood proudly beside bouquets of wildflowers. Nathaniel raised a toast, not to titles nor fortune, but to the quiet courage of women who choose love, despite every warning to the contrary. Arabella stood beside him, her hand in his, her smile easy, radiant. The walls no longer pressed around her, the air no longer demanded apology. She was no longer the invisible sister, no longer the girl who slept near the hearth while others danced. She was not someone's cautionary tale. She had loved. She had risked and she had endured. Now she was chosen, trusted, fiercely loved. As the rain tapered off and the windows steamed with warmth, Arabella stepped away for a moment, climbing the narrow steps of the bell tower above. The view stretched wide and green, the hills rolling in every direction, the violets shining even in dampness. She placed one hand on the worn wooden beam and closed her eyes, letting the memory of the bells settle inside her. The echo would remain long after the sound faded, and she, Arabella Kent, now Lady Bransmore, would remember this day not for the ceremony, nor even for the title it gave her, but for the moment the world finally knew what she had always been. Enough. Bransmore House had never been a place of laughter, until she came. Now, its halls echoed with tiny footsteps and shrieks of joy, the clatter of wooden toys down the grand staircase, and the distant hum of lullabies being sung beside nursery fires. It was the first warm morning of April, and the gardens shimmered with life. The lilacs had bloomed early this year, filling the air with a perfume that seemed to awaken memories rather than seasons. Arabella stood beneath one of the oldest oaks, her gloved hands folded over her waist, watching two figures tumble across the grass. Henry, now 16 and tall enough to rest his chin atop her head, was being ambushed by a 5-year-old girl with raven dark curls and a temper to match. "Let her win," Arabella called out gently, smiling. Henry looked over with exaggerated despair. "She fights dirty." "She takes after her father," she replied. From the terrace, Nathaniel approached with deliberate steps, a tray in his hands, silver teapot gleaming in the sunlight. His hair had begun to grey at the temples, though time had only deepened the quiet strength in his features. His smile was reserved for her alone, the kind of smile that still made her breath catch, even after 8 years of shared nights and long winters. He placed the tray on the wrought-iron table and leaned close, his lips brushing the curve of her ear. "She takes after you," he murmured. "Fierce, impossible to ignore, dangerous when denied sugar." Arabella laughed, resting her head briefly on his shoulder. "She will demand the world one day." "Why, and we'll give it to her," he said without hesitation. They had named her Eliza, after the woman who had once nursed Nathaniel's late wife in her final days, a quiet tribute to endurance and kindness in the shadows of grief. Eliza had arrived 2 years into their marriage, small and loud and full of impossible joy. 2 years later came James, solemn and serious from the start, who now spent his mornings with Mrs. Holloway, learning to read from the Psalms and puzzling over worms in the garden. Mrs. Holloway still lived with them, older now, slower in her steps, but never too weary to rock a child or offer a stern word to the cook. She had refused a formal room and still occupied the small corner chamber near the kitchen. "She's my anchor," Arabella often said, "even when the tide is kind." As for Louisa, she visited often, but never stayed long. Her marriage had come late, to a widower vicar with 2 small children of his own, and though her life was modest, her letters were full of gratitude. She had never asked Arabella for anything, only her forgiveness, and that had been given freely. Beatrice had not spoken to her sister in years. The last they heard, she had married an aging baron in Portsmouth, whose estate was rumoured to be drowning in debts. Her name had appeared once in a scandal sheet, briefly mentioned in connection to a failed inheritance suit. Nathaniel had burned the page before Arabella could read it. "Some ghosts," he had said, "are better left buried." Mrs. Kent had passed quietly 4 years prior, her final days spent in Bath, surrounded by friends who whispered in the corners about what might have been. Arabella had attended the funeral, standing at the back in a simple dress, with Henry at her side. She had not cried, but as they left the chapel, she had taken Nathaniel's hand and said, "I hope she found peace." Bransmore had changed too. The tenants, who once feared their landlord, now sent their children to the schoolhouse Arabella helped establish at the edge of the orchard. A new midwife had been appointed, trained in London, paid from Bransmore's profits, and no expectant mother now delivered without care. Arabella sat on every council that would have her, often dismissed by older men, until she spoke, and then, invariably, she was heard. It had taken years, years of second glances, of doubting whispers behind fans, of cold shoulders at balls, and stiff letters declining invitations. But over time, Arabella's name stopped being associated with scandal and began being spoken with quiet admiration. Not because she was an earl's wife, but because she was herself, unyielding, empathetic, unapologetically defiant of what society once expected from the invisible daughter of Bath. That morning, as the bell tower rang out 8 soft chimes, one for each year since their wedding, Arabella leaned against the stone balustrade and closed her eyes. She thought of that first spring, of violets on the hillside, of Henry's trembling hand offering her a wildflower bouquet, of Nathaniel, standing not as an earl but as a man stripped bare of pride, offering her not a future but a chance. And she had said yes, not to the title, not to the wealth, not to the redemption of her family's name, but to love, to risk, to the terrifying, beautiful act of choosing someone again and again through the seasons that weather and shape even the strongest hearts. Now she opened her eyes and looked at him. Nathaniel was kneeling in the grass, letting Eliza climb over his shoulders as Henry pretended to duel them both with a branch. He caught Arabella's gaze and smiled, the same soft smile he had given her in the laundry room of that crumbling townhouse years ago, and in that moment Arabella knew. Time had not dimmed their love. It had deepened it. And if the world ever forgot her name again, if the whispers returned, if every garden turned barren, she would still have this memory, this family, this truth, that love, once chosen in truth, does not vanish. It only echoes louder with each passing spring. Every heart that has ever loved in silence, every soul that has ever been overlooked, will find something of themselves in Arabella's journey. Her story reminds us that true love is not always loud or grand. It is patient, enduring, and often born in the quiet corners of life. It teaches us that dignity is not granted by society, but chosen in the moments when we stand firm, even when no one is watching. And perhaps the most powerful lesson of all, that healing doesn't erase the past, but transforms it into the strength we carry forward. If you made it to the end of this unforgettable tale, leave the word wildflowers in the comments. That way, we'll know who truly walked every step of this journey with Arabella, and it helps more people discover our stories too. If this story touched your heart, consider leaving a super thanks to support the team that lovingly brings these romances to life. Every contribution, big or small, helps us keep creating emotional, timeless narratives for you. And if a donation isn't possible right now, your support is still deeply felt. Simply sharing this video with a friend or loved one is a beautiful way to help. Don't forget to explore the other powerful stories we've linked in the cards. They're waiting to sweep you off your feet, just like this one. From our hearts to yours, thank you for listening.